Hello and welcome to Crossing Channels. I'm Richard Westcott. How can green finance drive the clean transition? That's the subject of the latest in our podcast collaboration between Cambridge University's Bennett Institute for Public Policy and the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse. As ever, we're going to use the interdisciplinary strengths of both institutions to explore a complex issue: how green finance can drive the transition to a sustainable future. What barriers and opportunities exist in aligning financial systems with climate goals? Finally, what strategies are needed to make the clean transition both inclusive and effective in addressing the pressing challenges of climate change? To explore these issues today, we have Dimitri Zenghelis from the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. So, Dimitri, start us off. What does your research focus on?
Thanks, Richard. So what I focus on at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge is to try and have an understanding of what the clean transition means for productivity and growth. And what we're finding is that, in fact, whereas the conventional framing of this problem is one where you have to commit large funds, which could have gone to something else, to decarbonising the economy, what we actually find is this generates a huge amount of innovation, efficiency, and productivity, such that it is, in fact, best thought of as a growth story. In fact, it's not only a growth story, it's probably the only viable growth story that's available.
Joining us from the IAST, we have Ulrich Hege and Mathias Reynaert. Ulrich, remind us of your main research interests.
Thank you, Richard. I'm an economist specialized in corporate finance, which is really how financial markets and institutions interact with companies and their investment decisions. I'm looking at two questions. First, how are they received by financial markets? How are financial markets reacting to them? And by that, giving stimulation to companies to actually innovate, a reward for that. And second, I'm also looking at, are these climate-related innovations actually serving the purpose, i.e. can we see that they are actually translating into emission reductions?
And Mathias, what's the central focus of your research?
So in my research, I take an empirical perspective and I study how environmental regulations impact markets, with a specific focus on how their strategic responses to the implementation of this regulation.
The global economy is transforming as green finance and regulation takes centre stage in the fight against climate change. By contrast, of course, what have we just seen? Day one, Donald Trump telling companies to drill, baby, drill. So let's begin with the big picture by defining what we mean by clean transition. Dimitri, what is the clean transition and its role in tackling climate change?
The clean transition is effectively the need to repurpose our economy, in particular the way we use and generate energy. But it's broader than that as well. It has implications for land use, it has implications for buildings, it has implications for industry. But, the bulk of this is about shifting away from fossil fuels, the burning of which, or even the industrial use of which, tends to generate dangerous greenhouse gases, which warm up the atmosphere and cause significant climate risks, increasing climate risks. Into something that is based much more on the use of electricity and electricity with energy generated by renewable energy. That's what we're seeing. The big question is, can we afford to do this? But what we're finding, and to some extent what we're not surprised by, but what seems to be happening even faster than we expected, is that this transition generates a huge amount of innovation, significant efficiency benefits, and therefore generates an increase in productivity. So that it's becoming increasingly apparent that rather than it being a question of, do we go for green or growth, the clean transition appears to be perhaps one of the most promising growth stories, and possibly the only viable growth story that's available. So the question of how we finance that transition therefore becomes centre stage.
So my assumption is, as an outsider, a lot of this is driven by government policies around the world. So why is it then, if it's so good for growth and productivity, why is it there's this kind of backlash going on against this green energy?
Part of the answer relates to the fossil fuel industry and drill, baby, drill. Now, the fossil fuel industry has a lot to lose from this clean transition. Oil, in particular, is fungible and storable. So the fossil fuel industry does not want you to think that the clean transition is viable, because the price of oil today is a function of the price of oil in the future, and the price of oil in the future is a function of there being strong demand for fossil fuels. So there's no merit to them in talking up the clean transition. They will quite happily align with some environmentalists who will tell you that you can't kill fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are resilient. We'll be using them well into the coming century. And that therefore we need to consider other measures, which of course people won't consider, such as degrowth and cutting back consumption. In fact, it turns out that fossil fuels are probably likely to peak sometime towards the end of this decade. They may even be peaking in China already. They've peaked in the US, in the UK, in Europe, and in other key markets already, because fossil fuels are simply not a very good way of generating energy, and we have far superior technological alternatives. But that requires upfront investment, and it's that upfront investment, as well as the disruption associated with transitioning your economy, that generates the opposition.
Okay, let's move on to financing then. Ulrich, can you define really what we mean by green finance, and how does that fit into this transition?
I think it makes sense to talk about two different notions of green finance. On one hand, you have the top-down view. How can we mobilize the financial resources needed to actually accelerate the green transition to net zero? And there are many estimates how much would be needed, say, to come close to a goal like net zero 2050. But I think a reasonable estimate, it would be 5 trillion a year, so 2.5 times more. But to put it also in perspective, that's like 5% of world GDP, so that's a big number. But the world is also spending like 25 trillion a year in investment, so it's something that's not completely out of proportion if the will is there. The second notion of green finance is really the bottom-up or grassroots movement among investors that has emerged over many years, investors that are concerned about the environment and the climate change. And at some point they're saying, hey, this transition is not happening on its own. The governments are not doing it, so we are basically pitching in and we are basically reallocating our funds where they're needed away from companies, the brown companies. We are basically making their financing more expensive and towards companies that are greening up faster, making their cost of capital lower and going there to these companies. And I think that has some impact. It is a movement that has emerged over many years, over the last 30 years, has grown in particular in the years, say, 2018, 2021, in the COVID period. And we can see that it's an impact, for example, in really making financing for the expansion of coal extraction, coal power plants, more expensive even for oil and gas, and they are on a retreat also because of this grassroots movement in finance.
And out of interest, this grassroots movement, is that big investors, big sort of pension funds and things? Is it small investors, individuals choosing to do this? Both?
I think it first started from individuals and then a lot of institutions, in particular institutions that have a lot of individuals behind them, like pension funds, and so picked it up and also said we have environmental and other so-called ESG, environmental social governance goals in mind, so extra financial or non-financial goals in our investment policies. So it's really both.
Mathias, let's look at sectors now, and the automotive industry, an area you know lots about. And it's close to my heart because I used to be a transport correspondent at the BBC, and one of the big stories I covered was the VW emissions scandal. I'm sure everyone remembers that. And in all honesty, what I saw during that time was the vehicle industry talking a good game on going green and yet really dragging its heels to go green, especially in Europe, which surprised me. It was California that really brought this to light. So let's look at perhaps the role of regulation in influencing the speed and scale of the clean transition in the automotive industry. I mean, do you think those regulations are effective or robust enough? And is that clean transition happening?
There's a lot of empirical evidence that regulation and fiscal policies such as subsidies and tax exemptions are very effective. We see that when there is more stringent regulation or larger price corrections by governments, we do see that innovation ticks up, we do see that technology adoption by firms picks up, and we do see that consumers buy greener alternatives. And so it works, but it's very important to recognize that what is happening is that we are correcting markets. And so this regulation is basically asking firms to deviate from their profit optimizing strategies, because it would be profit optimizing for these firms to basically keep selling polluting products that they've already invested in and that they're making comfortable profits on. And so you're asking these firms with a regulation to deviate from their profit optimizing strategy. And so that means that regulation needs to be enforced. And that's where things in Europe have also been going wrong, as I showed in my research, that the emission standard had a large effect on paper, but it remained limited to an effect on paper to a large extent, because what happened was that car makers basically found a way to game emission standards, and that was like the crucial aspect of the Volkswagen scandal, but it also played a large role in Europe. And so firms were to a large extent responding to the regulation by just getting more CO2 efficient on paper, but not implementing these CO2 efficiencies on the road. And so we need to keep in mind that we have these types of regulations that force firms to go towards greener alternatives, that we also need enforcement. And so that is a necessary condition to basically correct the market.
Does it start with upfront government money? I remember going to Norway. They had special lanes that you could go in with an electric car. You could use the bus lane. They had chargers everywhere, including in the Arctic Circle. They had subsidies for buying an electric car, and it was the first country to go, I think, more than half electric in new sales. Elsewhere in the UK, for example, there's less infrastructure to charge your car. And that's government money, isn't it? Car makers aren't going to put that in.
No, absolutely. And I think it's important, and I want to refer back to something that Dimitri pointed out earlier. There's vested interest here, and you have basically an industry that is profitable and that is basically all present in the economy. There's gas stations, there are car models with diesel and gasoline engines. There are brands that make profits on these. And so when we think about what are the main roadblocks to a transition in the automotive sector, I think one of them is really vested interests. So it would not have been Volkswagen that would have started innovating, making electric vehicles, because there would be cannibalization of their own profits. And so in a certain extent, it's not a surprise that Tesla was a complete outsider making these products. And the second roadblock, I think, is really a coordination issue, and that makes it very difficult. It's you basically have a whole industry. Consumers are used to driving gasoline engines. They are used to going to gasoline stations. These gasoline stations are prevalent everywhere. But also, if you look upstream in the supply chain, all of these suppliers are making components for combustion engines. We don't have the supply chain in place yet for massive EV production, etc. So there's also a large coordination issue that you need to get all noses in the same direction. I think it's interesting that you already pointed out the Norway example. I think I have three examples of where it worked. The first one is Tesla, and what is specific about Tesla is that they did a lot themselves across the supply chain. They had their own high-speed charging network. They had a lot of the components made in-house, and so basically they avoided the coordination issue by doing as much in-house as possible. That didn't topple the whole industry. That was just one brand that decided to do that. So then we had Norway, and what Norway did, as you pointed out, was investing a lot of government money by making EVs tax exempt and also making as much of the public space available to electric vehicles, so these lanes and all of these other provisions. And so that was a massive coordination issue in Norway that basically said we're going to have this transition, and puts all noses in the same direction. And the third example where we saw this, or are seeing this, is China, where China has for the last decade subsidized enormous amounts of money to battery development, and at the same point had large coordinated plans of moving their industry from a combustion-oriented industry to an electrified industry. And so government money seems in the successful examples that we have so far a crucial element of the transition. Yeah.
Dimitri, let's look at another sector now, the public sector. Can it afford to fund a clean transition?
Well, the primary role of the public sector is not to fund the clean transition. The funding's going to come from private investors. The role of the public sector is to enable the private sector to make risk-adjusted profits in the expectation that there will be a core market in these sectors. I mean, let's not forget, we're talking here about energy, we're talking here about transport, we're talking about buildings. These are some of the most heavily policy-driven and policy-regulated sectors in our entire, in our economies, and for good reason. And so if the policy framework doesn't signal to the private sector that the risks are skewed more towards locking into inefficient, expensive fossil fuel infrastructure, which may be met with future hostile policy and may be outcompeted by new technologies, rather than towards the clean transition, then we know which way the private sector is going to invest. What we're finding, of course, is that the clean transition does generate substantial returns in and of itself, and therefore is something that the public sector, through broad-ranged policies, can help signal to the private sector that there's money to be made. Of course, the public sector will have to invest in some core infrastructure. You've talked about recharging stations for electric vehicles. A key part of the infrastructural rollout of electricity grids is going to rely on some public sector support. Skills training of the workforce, again, that's going to require some direct public money. But by far the bulk of this is going to come from the private sector. Of course, China is an exemplar in this. It took a strategic decision to push solar PV and electric vehicles and batteries at a time when they were still very expensive and uncompetitive. The costs have come down massively through learning by doing in these sectors, but also through scaling up of massive production lines. You've seen these gigafactories in southern China, these solar PV plants. The costs have come down now such that all of these technologies are more than competitive against conventional fossil fuel technologies, and China is cornering the market in these possibly some of the fastest growing markets in the world. They've left the US and the Europeans standing. They took that strategic decision. That, I think, is the primary role of policy in the public sector.
Looking ahead, each of you, what's one financial mechanism or policy or innovation that you believe could have a really significant impact in driving this clean transition, say, over the next decade? So let's start with you, Ulrich.
Yeah, the most important thing is the innovation that has really contributed very importantly, right? It's perhaps the one big success story. And private markets will do that, but they need a reliability. Like they need that the policies are basically predictable and there for the long term. You only invest in innovation, you have this predictability. So if you see what just happened in the United States when 2022, like the Biden administration rolled out the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a very big and perhaps the biggest green innovation incentive ever, and it attracted a lot of capital. Only 2 years later, by the stroke of a pen, in 2 weeks after the Trump administration took over, seen it tossed out. That's the exact opposite what needs to happen, right? We need this predictability to provide like incentives for private investment. I think that is the first thing. We are getting to the point where green technologies are getting cost competitive or even cheaper. But there's one snag which is still there. A lot of them actually require a lot of upfront financing, and then they have very low operating costs. That's true for photovoltaic panels, for windmills, and all these kind of things, for home insulation, for heat pumps. And there we have a problem of financial friction. So a lot of these technologies will not be adopted fast enough in poorer countries because of financial frictions. Financial frictions just means that the people that need to invest cannot raise the financing because those who have the financing banks, funds will not provide them to them because they don't have collateral, they don't have guaranteed income, there's too much political uncertainty. And that's where really also financial innovation, which you ask about, can step in. Right? We need more of this, basically like public development banks and other like public institutions stepping in a way that is not too costly for the taxpayer in the developed countries in Europe, in the UK and elsewhere, but just providing smart guarantees and building up the financial infrastructure, we can actually have a big impact. And that also can help a little bit heal this old wound about the North-South conflict, about who is paying for the green transition.
And Matthias?
Given what we're seeing in the US political environment is how stable the implementation of environmental policy in Europe will be. As Ulrich pointed out, we are establishing a whole bunch of instruments in Europe, such as the expanded ETS and the Green Deal, etc. But you can feel that there's also part of the political spectrum that is looking for political gains of protesting against those regulations. And so that has been part of the success of the Trump movement in the US, I think. And I'm curious to see how robust the regulation is that we have established now is politically in the near future. I think that's very important. The second thing that I have my eyes on is India and China. Economic growth there and the extent to which that goes in tandem with the deployment of renewables is really important. And the energy sector in China and India should have our prime attention.
And finally, Dimitri, we'll leave the last word to you.
Always dangerous. There isn't a single policy mechanism or innovation that's going to drive this, and that's really important. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It's really about the credibility. It says, just as Ulrich said, it's about the predictability and the credibility of the policy regime, such that it is convincing to investors that this is a sector behind which the government is going to provide the support necessary for the private sector to make profits. And that's got to be a medium to long-term commitment. So, flipping and flopping and sending mixed signals is clearly going to deter investment. It's going to push up the cost of capital by raising the risk premium associated with these new sectors. So a clear, credible policy stance, and that means a mix of policies. Some of it will be pricing. Some of it will be standards and regulations. Some of it will be R&D support. Some of it will be deployment support. Some of it will be outright bans, whether it's gas boilers or electric vehicles, by combustion engine vehicles by certain years. But the point is, it's got to be broad-based, it's got to be clear, and it's got to be credible. The transition of the electricity sector and the electric and the car vehicle sector, the pace of this has been extraordinary. And if you think about it, it's happened on the back of really quite minimal policy effort. There has been policy effort, key players, whether it's in Denmark, in Germany, in the UK, in California, there has been public money, there's been taxpayer money put into developing these new technologies. Of course, China, perhaps foremost amongst those countries that have pushed these sectors. But that money has delivered extraordinary returns. A third of our emissions come from cars and from electricity. And, that third is already in the bag, if you like. It's not going to be long before we see similar increases in innovation, in efficiency and productivity in the so-called hard-to-abate sectors, haulage, industry, agriculture and food, and even aviation. I think it looks untenable now, just as it looked untenable 10 years ago to talk about a transition in electricity and vehicles. But I think in 5, 10, 15 years' time, provided the policy stance and policy framework is clear and credible, we are in a position to see extraordinary and very productive growth-enhancing gains in the process of delivering the clean transition that we all need. But it does require an early push, and it does require upfront investment, and that, of course, is where the political will needs to come in, and the leadership as well.
Fantastic. Well, that's an optimistic note to end on, and a message for governments as well. So I just want to thank Dimitri Zenghelis from the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, Ulrich Hege and Mathias Reynaert from the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse for their Really interesting research and insights. Now, let us know what you think of this latest episode of Season 4 of Crossing Channels. If you enjoyed it, leave us a review. It helps us to shape future episodes and helps people to find us, so we do appreciate it. And do please listen to other Crossing Channels episodes. Recently, we've looked at everything from how algorithms and data impact our lives to whether we're suffering from more mental health problems or we're just more aware of them. Next month is an essential listen where we'll be talking about industrial policy and innovation.